The house had always been silent, the kind of quiet that pressed against your skin, making the air feel thicker, colder. But tonight it felt different. The shadows in the corners of every room seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the house itself was alive, watching. Jamie stood in the middle of the hallway, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. The whispers had started again, faint at first, barely audible, but now they were louder, clearer, like a voice trying to break through the walls. She turned, the darkness of the house pressing in, and wondered, had the house always been this way? Or was it her? Or was it something far worse? The darkness outside seemed absolute, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, as if the world was holding its breath. It wasn't the kind of night that invited peace. Rather, it lured you into a false sense of calm, preparing for the dread to come. Somewhere, beyond the fragile veil of the quiet night, something stirred. But what? No one could say for sure. You feel it. It hangs there, in the periphery of your senses, waiting for the perfect moment to make itself known. As the clock ticked past midnight, the old, tired house creaked under the weight of time. A soft wind stirred the air outside, brushing against windows that had long since grown accustomed to the chill. The streetlights outside flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floorboards. This was a night that would stick with you. A night that, once lived, would haunt you forever. And no matter how many years passed, you'd still be haunted by the memories, because some things refused to be forgotten. It was supposed to be like any other night. People tucked into bed after a long day, the routine of life continuing as always. But this night, this one, was different. The first story would pull you in, slow, almost gentle, but never let you go. It whispered to your instincts, calling out from the depth of the unknown. And once you began, once you let it fill you up, you could never truly leave. Have you ever been so alone, so utterly isolated, that even the silence becomes oppressive? That the space around you feels too big, too open, as though the walls themselves are slowly closing in? And what happens when you're forced to confront something that isn't supposed to be there? Something that you can't explain, something that doesn't belong in the world you know? That's when things get complicated. The first story begins on a quiet road, outside the scope of ordinary town life. A road so rural that it felt like the universe itself had forgotten it existed. It was the perfect place to get lost, and that's exactly what happened. A woman, tired from the long drive, pulled off the main road, hoping to find some peace. The headlights cut through the darkness, the only source of light in an expanse of pitch-black wilderness. She hadn't planned to stop here. The GPS had malfunctioned hours ago, but she'd kept driving, thinking the town would just pop up eventually. It didn't. She took the last turn, hoping to find a gas station or a house. Anything. But as she made that turn, she saw it. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, tired after so many hours on the road. A figure, standing in the middle of the road, watching her. No movement. Just staring. A chill ran down her spine. She tapped the brakes, slowing down as she tried to make sense of it. It couldn't be a person, could it? It was too far out of the way, too isolated for anyone to be walking there. But then again, it couldn't be anything else. She was still a good 15 miles from the nearest town. Who would be here at this hour? Her mind raced, a million possibilities flooding her thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. She hesitated. Was it a trick of the light? A shadow cast by a tree or a rock? Or was it something more sinister? There was no way to know for sure, but she had no choice but to find out. As she cautiously stepped out of the car, the world around her seemed to hold its breath. Every sound, every gust of wind, felt like it was echoing in slow motion. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck standing up, a primal warning telling her to turn back. But she didn't. No, she took a few hesitant steps forward, each footfall sinking into the gravel with a small crunch. The figure didn't move. It remained still, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for her. The moonlight revealed more details. A figure dressed in old, faded clothing, almost too tattered to be real. The pale light illuminated its face, and her breath caught in her throat. There was something wrong. The figure's skin looked wrong, too smooth, almost too perfect. It was as if it didn't belong there, like it was out of place. She wanted to scream, but the words were stuck, frozen in her throat. In a rush of panic, she backed away, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her eyes never left the figure, and yet, as she stepped back, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just standing there anymore. She wasn't alone. The air had thickened. Something had shifted. She was no longer in control. Her movements, even as she turned to run, were sluggish, as if the very earth beneath her was fighting her. The figure in the road didn't chase her, not yet. It remained in the same spot, but its presence, its sheer, unyielding presence, loomed over her like a fog. And the deeper she ran, the more she realized it wasn't just the figure she feared. It was the way the land felt wrong now, the way the world around her had changed. The trees didn't seem like trees anymore. The shadows that clung to them were too long, too deep. The air smelled different, too thick with something she couldn't quite name. But it was enough. It was enough to make her stop and listen to the world around her, to realize that this was no ordinary place. And no matter how far she ran, the figure was still there. Watching. She didn't know it then, but that moment, the moment she looked into the face of the unknown, was the last time her reality would feel solid. By now, most people would have rationalized the fear away, convinced themselves it was just the product of a tired mind or a random trick of the night. But not her. She knew something was wrong. Something deeper. Something that would follow her home. It wasn't just a person in the road. It was something older, something that existed outside the bounds of logic and time. And as the hours dragged on, as she continued to drive, she realized the figure wasn't following her. It was in her car, in her thoughts. It would always be there, waiting for the moment when she would forget. Waiting for the moment when the night would come again. And as her headlights slowly disappeared into the blackness, one thought gnawed at her. Was it real? Or had she already crossed a threshold from which there was no return? There's always a part of you that wishes it was all just a nightmare. That you could wake up and tell yourself, it was nothing. Just my imagination. But the truth is, once you've seen it, once you've felt it, it never truly leaves. The quiet streets, the low hum of the wind, the solitude, it's all a lie. And deep down you know it. You feel it. Whatever was out there that night, it's still there. Watching. Waiting. The first story is over, but the night is still young. What's coming next will challenge everything you think you know about the world, and when the last tale is told, you won't be able to look at the night the same way again. Not ever. The wind had begun to howl through the trees, sharp gusts that rattled the branches like old bones. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the forest in an oppressive, inky darkness. A lone hiker trudged along a narrow, winding trail, his boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. He had been walking for hours, the terrain rough and uneven, the night growing colder with each passing minute. He had planned for a brief excursion, a quick hike to clear his head, but now, deep in the woods, the sense of being lost was starting to settle in. His name was Jack. He was young, in his late 20s, and had been used to hiking alone, but tonight was different. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite place, but it was there. A weight. It pressed down on him, and the forest seemed to breathe with him, each inhale and exhale in sync with the rhythm of the wind. Jack had tried to laugh it off earlier, telling himself it was just the isolation getting to him. But now, as the darkness pressed in closer, as the trees closed ranks on the narrow path, he couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. The forest, thick with the smell of moss and decaying leaves, stretched out endlessly in all directions. The trail he had been following was little more than a faint, worn path, barely visible through the undergrowth. His flashlight flickered occasionally, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move when they shouldn't. At first, it was easy to dismiss, just a malfunction, a low battery, but now, in the silence of the woods, every flicker felt like an omen. He paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his forehead despite the chill in the air. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, but Jack pushed it aside. He was just being paranoid, right? He was in the woods, far from civilization. It was normal to feel a little strange in a place like this. Still, the eerie quiet of the forest was unsettling. No animal sounds. No wind in the trees. It was as if the forest had gone mute, holding its breath. He pulled out his phone to check the time, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy, but the screen was dark. He tried again, tapping it with his fingers, but nothing. A dead phone on a dead trail, in the middle of nowhere. Not ideal. With a frustrated sigh, Jack stuffed the phone back in his pocket and started walking again. He needed to focus on getting back. The more he wandered, the more lost he felt. His original plan had been to follow the trail to a clearing he had been to once before, then turn back and make his way to the campsite. Simple. But now, the trees seemed to stretch on forever. The path had narrowed until it was almost unrecognizable, and the world around him was taking on a strange, otherworldly quality. The shadows weren't shadows anymore. They were shapes, shifting and moving out of the corner of his eyes, and Jack could no longer tell if they were real or if it was his mind playing tricks. As the minutes stretched on, and the wind howled through the dense foliage, Jack began to feel the panic rising in his chest. He had to get back. He had to retrace his steps. He turned around, expecting to see the path he had just walked, but instead, the trees behind him looked different. The angles, the way the branches hung, it all felt. It wasn't the same path anymore. How could it have changed so quickly? For a moment, Jack just stood there, staring at the trees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Was he imagining it? He took a step forward, then another and another, but every step only seemed to deepen the confusion. The forest had become a labyrinth, and he couldn't remember which way was which. He stumbled. A root, hidden under the thick layer of fallen leaves, caught his foot, and he went down hard, his knees slamming against the earth. He cursed under his breath, biting his lip to stifle the pain. As he pushed himself to his feet, his flashlight flickered once again, casting a pale, unstable light over the surroundings. That's when he saw it. Just at the edge of his beam, standing perfectly still among the trees, was a figure. Tall and thin, its outline was nearly indistinguishable from the shadows themselves, blending into the forest in a way that made it seem more like a part of the night. But it was there, watching. Jack froze, his pulse quickening. The figure didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. For a moment, Jack thought it was a trick of the light, his tired eyes playing tricks on him, but deep down he knew it wasn't. He could feel it in his gut, a visceral certainty that churned in his stomach. He raised his flashlight, his hand trembling as the beam cut through the darkness toward the figure. The light hit the spot where the figure stood, but it was gone. Just like that. As if it had melted back into the forest, into the shadows. Jack's heart raced as he swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest around him was empty. The silence returned, as deep and suffocating as it had been before. He stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a person? No, it couldn't be. Who would be out here at this hour, in this remote place? And if it was someone, why had they disappeared so quickly? His mind raced, but the only thing he could focus on was the unmistakable sensation that he wasn't alone. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees growing taller, their twisted branches reaching toward him like skeletal fingers. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the darkness just beyond his reach. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move. The more he stood there, the more his fear grew, and he knew he couldn't afford to stay still. But no matter which direction he turned, the trees seemed to twist and distort, the shadows lengthening as if they were following him. There was no path now, no sign of the way he had come. Every turn felt like he was going deeper into the heart of the forest, where the light of the moon could never reach. Jack's thoughts scrambled. He needed to get out. He needed to find the trail. He forced his legs to move, but the feeling of being watched never left him. It was as if the very forest itself had turned against him, a sentient, living thing that watched his every step, waited for him to make a mistake. And then, as if the trees had finally conspired to lead him astray, he heard it. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable, footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. They weren't his. He froze again, the blood draining from his face. His heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were too close, far too close. He spun around, desperate to catch sight of whoever or whatever was following him, but the forest had swallowed the sound again. Was he imagining it? His mind was working in overdrive, trying to make sense of the impossible. He couldn't think straight. He just had to keep moving. He pushed forward, breaking through the underbrush, each step faster than the last, his breath coming in short bursts. He didn't know if the footsteps were real or if it was just his fear playing tricks on him. But as he moved, his flashlight flickered one last time and went out. The darkness rushed in like a tide, suffocating, overwhelming, and in that moment, Jack knew, deep in his bones, that whatever had been following him, it wasn't human. And it was still out there. The house had been quiet for days. Even the creaks of the old wood seemed to have settled, as if the building itself had grown accustomed to its long-forgotten history. But that morning, something felt different. Something had shifted, imperceptibly at first. A chill in the air, a flicker of movement at the edge of the eye, small things that, when pieced together, began to form a pattern too strange to ignore. Samantha and David, newlyweds, had only moved into the house a few months ago. It was an old Victorian-style home, tucked away on the outskirts of town, isolated enough to offer the kind of privacy they'd longed for. The space felt expansive, almost too expansive, with rooms that seemed to go on forever and hallways that twisted and turned in unexpected directions. From the moment they'd stepped inside, they'd been drawn to it, despite its age and wear. There was something charming about it, something nostalgic that made them feel at home in a way they couldn't explain. At first, things were peaceful. They'd unpacked their boxes, rearranged the furniture, and even taken a moment to admire the overgrown garden out back. But then came the first strange occurrence. A soft noise in the middle of the night. A whisper, just faint enough to make them question whether they'd heard it at all. Samantha had asked David about it, but he shrugged it off. Just the wind, he had said. But Samantha wasn't so sure. The whispers had continued, growing in volume over time, as if something, or someone, was trying to speak through the walls. She had mentioned it again to David, but his response was always the same. It's nothing. Just your imagination. But as the weeks went on, Samantha began to feel something else. The house felt alive. Every room, every corner, seemed to breathe, as if it had its own pulse. The walls groaned at night, the floorboards creaked in the mornings, and the air itself grew thick with a sense of waiting. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding just beneath the surface, something that didn't want them there. David, on the other hand, remained unfazed. His skepticism was unshakable, and while Samantha's unease deepened, he dismissed it with a laugh, claiming that it was just the settling of an old house. But Samantha felt it, a presence, a coldness in the air that seemed to watch them even when they weren't looking. She would catch glimpses of something in the corner of her vision, a flicker of movement that vanished the moment she turned her head. But when she would ask David if he'd seen it, he always said no. He never saw what she saw. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness crept in, Samantha stood in front of the large mirror in their hallway. It was an antique piece, framed in dark wood, its surface slightly cloudy with age. She hadn't paid much attention to it before, but that night, something about it caught her eye. As she stared into it, she thought she saw a figure behind her, standing just out of view, hidden in the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned quickly, expecting to find David. But the hallway was empty. Her breath quickened as she turned back to the mirror, her pulse racing. The reflection was unchanged, yet there was something in the air that made her skin crawl. She wasn't sure why, but the mirror felt wrong. It felt as though it was hiding something, something that didn't want to be seen. But what? She couldn't say. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the mirror, and for a moment she thought she saw it, just a flicker of movement, too fast to identify. But when she blinked, the reflection returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. "Are you okay?" David's voice broke through the silence, and Samantha spun around, startled. I thought I saw something," she said, her voice shaky. David looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Saw something? What?" "I don't know. A figure. Just for a second in the mirror." She tried to explain, but her words felt hollow, empty. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? David simply shrugged, his face softening with a reassuring smile. It's probably just the lighting or your nerves. You've been stressed lately. He reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Let's go relax, okay? I'll make us some tea. But Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they sat down in the living room later, she found herself glancing at the mirror every now and then, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the room was still, eerily still, and the air hung heavy around them. Days passed, but the unease only deepened. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. Samantha began to notice other things, small details that were harder to ignore. The way the air in the house grew unnaturally cold at night, the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls, the way the lights would flicker for no apparent reason. She tried to talk to David again, but his patience was growing thin. Samantha, you've got to stop with this, he said one evening, his voice tinged with frustration. There's nothing here. It's just a house, okay? Nothing to be afraid of. But the more David dismissed her concerns, the stronger the feeling grew. Samantha couldn't help but feel as though something was lurking just out of reach, something that had been there long before they arrived. Then came the night the whispers became louder. It was late, and they had just finished dinner. David had gone into the kitchen to clean up, and Samantha was alone in the living room, staring at the fire as it crackled in the hearth. She had just started to drift off when she heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. But it was there. She sat up straight, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound had come from behind her, from the hallway. She didn't dare move, her body frozen with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The whispering came again, louder this time, as if the walls themselves were speaking. The words were unintelligible, just fragments of sentences, as if someone was trying to communicate from a place far beyond the physical world. Her hands trembled as she stood up, slowly, carefully, and walked toward the hallway. As she stepped into the dim light of the corridor, the whispering stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. And then the house groaned. A deep, low sound, as if the very foundations were shifting. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her eyes wide with panic. What was happening? What was that sound? Before she could react, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above her. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor above them, as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth in the darkness. She turned to the stairs, her body shaking with a mix of fear and disbelief. David must have heard it too. He had to have. David, she called out, but her voice sounded distant, as if swallowed by the house itself. She hurried to the stairs, her heart racing, the cold air growing even colder. As she ascended, the footsteps grew louder, closer. They were in the room above her now. She was almost there, just one more step, one more. But when she reached the top of the stairs and pushed open the door to the bedroom, it was empty. No one was there. Just the old furniture, the bed they'd slept in just hours before. Nothing was out of place, and yet, the air was thick as though the room itself were holding its breath. Samantha stumbled back, a gasp escaping her lips. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation. And then, just as she was about to turn away, she heard it again. A voice, clear and unmistakable, coming from behind her. Get out! She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. But there was no one there. No one. Just the silence of the house, pressing in on her from every angle, suffocating her, holding her in its grip. The house was silent, as it always was in the late hours of the night, but tonight, the stillness felt heavier. The kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle, your thoughts feel slow, as though the world outside had come to a stop, leaving only the suffocating quiet. For Alex, a quiet, introverted teenager with a penchant for the strange and unusual, this silence felt like an invitation. The antique mirror in the hallway, a relic from the past that had been there when they first moved in, beckoned him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the design that had caught his eye, though the ornate frame with intricate carvings was mesmerizing in its own right. It was something deeper, something in the reflection that unnerved him, something about it that felt wrong. The first time Alex had seen the mirror clearly was several days after moving in. At first, it had been nothing more than a fixture in the hallway, part of the house's history, something old and forgotten by the previous owners. But when Alex passed it one evening, his gaze had caught the reflection of something out of place. A brief flicker, a shadow moving behind him, where there should have been nothing. He'd chalked it up to exhaustion, or perhaps the house settling. Old buildings were prone to making strange noises, weren't they? But over the following nights, his unease grew. Every time he walked past the mirror, it felt as if the reflection wasn't quite right. It seemed just a little too still, a little too perfect. He would glance at it, and for a split second, he swore he saw something, or someone, just behind him, watching. At first, he didn't tell anyone. His parents had been busy with the move, trying to settle into their new life, and his older brother had been too caught up in his own world to pay attention to anything Alex was experiencing. Besides, who would believe him? A teenage boy seeing things in an old mirror? It sounded absurd, even to him. But as the days passed, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something in the mirror had a life of its own. He could sense its presence, not in the reflection but in the very air around it. It was a subtle pressure, like the air had thickened around the glass. The house, too, had begun to feel wrong in ways he couldn't explain. It was a feeling that settled deep in his bones, the sense that he was not alone here, that something was watching, waiting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness began to take over, Alex found himself standing in front of the mirror again, his eyes drawn to it almost involuntarily. The reflection in the glass was sharp, the lines of the hallway crisp in the low light. But then, as he stared, he saw it, just for a moment, a shadow flickering in the corner of the mirror. A figure, standing so still that it blended with the darkness around it. He blinked, certain that he had imagined it, but when he looked again, the figure was still there, only now it was closer. His heart skipped a beat. Panic rose in his chest, suffocating him. He stepped back, but his legs felt frozen, heavy, as if the mirror had rooted him to the spot. His breath came out in short gasps, the silence of the house pressing against him like a physical weight. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the hallway, but there was nothing there. No figure. No movement. Just the emptiness of the house, the stillness that seemed to mock him. But when he turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. The reflection was as it had been before, empty, still, and unremarkable. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the glass, waiting for something, anything, to move, to prove to him that he hadn't imagined it. But nothing happened. The house was quiet again, unnervingly so. Alex shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts clouding his mind. Maybe he was just overtired. Maybe the strange atmosphere of the house was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something had changed. He could feel it, like an uninvited guest lingering just beyond his perception. There was something wrong with the mirror. Something that didn't belong in this world. And he couldn't escape it. The next day, Alex avoided the hallway, avoiding the mirror as much as he could. But that night, after dinner, he found himself inexplicably drawn to it again. It was as though the mirror was calling to him, pulling him in with an unseen force. This time, as he approached, the air around him felt colder, the temperature dropping several degrees as if the very space surrounding the glass had grown darker. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and took a cautious step forward. For a brief moment, he stood there, watching his own reflection. Everything seemed normal as it should, until it didn't. His reflection shifted slightly, the outline of his body moving a fraction of a second after his own. It wasn't like a delay, it was deliberate, like the reflection was doing its own thing, independent of him. His stomach churned, and he stepped back quickly, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He couldn't look away. The figure in the mirror was there again. But this time, it wasn't just standing behind him. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately. A tall silhouette, black against the reflection of the hallway, its features indistinct. The more Alex stared, the more the figure seemed to take shape, its features becoming clearer, its body more defined. It was a man. Or, at least, it resembled one, tall, thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into Alex, even though they weren't really looking at him. Alex's heart hammered in his chest as he took a shaky step back. He couldn't breathe. His legs felt weak, his vision blurring. It was as if the world around him had shrunk, focused only on the figure in the mirror. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure in the reflection tilted its head, as if examining him. It didn't smile. It didn't speak. It just watched. And then, with a sudden, jerking movement, it stepped forward. Alex stumbled back, his hand crashing into the wall behind him. He felt the air shift, as if the atmosphere itself had changed, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw the figure's hand reaching out of the mirror toward him. His breath hitched in his throat, his vision blurring as panic seized him. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty house. The sound of his own heart pounding in his ears drowned out everything else. He didn't stop running until he reached his room and slammed the door behind him. He pressed his back against the door, panting, trying to catch his breath. But his mind was reeling, spinning. What had just happened? Was it real? Had the figure really tried to reach for him? He couldn't answer the questions, not yet. His head swam with confusion, fear, and disbelief. But as he stood there, heart still racing, something else crept into his thoughts, the knowledge that he couldn't escape it. The mirror wasn't just reflecting the world. It was showing him something else. Something darker, something that wanted to cross over. And he had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. The night had fallen deeper than usual. It was one of those oppressive nights where the darkness seemed to curl around you, thick and almost suffocating. For Marcus, the darkness wasn't just a physical absence of light. It was something more, a presence that lurked in the spaces between thoughts, in the silence of the house. The small cabin in the woods, once a peaceful escape from the chaos of city life, had started to feel like a prison. Every night, the eerie quiet seemed to get under his skin, scratching away at his peace of mind until he was left with nothing but the cold, creeping dread that something was wrong. Marcus had always prided himself on his rational mind. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts or things that went bump in the night. But the longer he stayed in the cabin, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house, tucked away far from the nearest town, had been isolated for years, and Marcus had taken it as the perfect place for a quiet retreat. But that was before the strange things started happening. At first, it was small, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye when there was no one there, the sudden feeling of being watched when he was alone. The little things that could be easily explained away as tricks of the mind. But those things began to escalate, and soon, there was no denying that something was off. It began with the noises. The first night, Marcus had woken to the sound of footsteps above him. He had checked every room, convinced that an animal had gotten in, or maybe even a trespasser. But the cabin had been empty. No sign of forced entry, no strange tracks in the dust. Just the unsettling echoes of footsteps in the middle of the night. He had convinced himself it was the house settling. Old houses made strange noises. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Footsteps in the dark, sometimes slow and measured, sometimes quick and erratic, as if someone was pacing above him, just out of sight. The isolation made it worse. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the nearest town was even farther. No one could hear him if he screamed, no one could come to help. It was just him, in this cabin that had once felt so safe, now feeling like it was closing in around him. The loneliness gnawed at him, amplifying every little sound, making his mind twist with fears he couldn't control. One evening, after a particularly restless night, Marcus had decided to confront whatever was causing these disturbances. It had to be something explainable, something he could rationalize. He decided to stay awake that night, determined to find the source of the noises. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the room as he sat in a chair by the window, waiting, watching, listening. The house was still, the kind of stillness that made his skin crawl. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of leaves outside, seemed amplified, as though the night itself was conspiring to make him lose his sanity. He must have nodded off at some point, because the next thing he knew, he was jolted awake by a loud crash. His heart leapt into his throat, and for a split second, he thought someone had broken into the cabin. His hand shot to the flashlight on the table beside him, and he flicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness like a knife. He stood up, cautiously stepping toward the source of the noise, which seemed to come from the kitchen. The wooden floors creaked under his weight, each step a drumbeat in the silence. His breath was shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. When he reached the kitchen, he found nothing. The window was still shut tight, the cabinets in their usual place, the floor undisturbed. The only thing out of place was the feeling, the heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched, of knowing that something was there, something just out of sight. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of panic. He had to remain calm. This was just his mind playing tricks on him. There was nothing here. But as he turned to leave, he saw it. In the reflection of the window, something moved. At first, he thought it was his own reflection, distorted in the glass, but when he turned around, there was no one there. His heart skipped, and for a moment his mind struggled to process what he had seen. The reflection, for that brief instant, had shown someone standing just behind him, tall, shadowed, with no distinct features. The figure was barely visible, like an outline, a smear of darkness against the reflection of the cabin's interior. But it was there, and it was watching him. Marcus didn't know what to do. His legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was just a trick of the light, a result of the dark shadows outside. But something in him knew that wasn't true. He could feel it deep in his gut, a cold, gnawing certainty that he was not alone. Slowly, cautiously, he turned back toward the window, his breath shallow, his hands shaking as he wiped the fog off the glass. The reflection was gone. He stared at the window for a long time, his pulse racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no logical explanation. No person in the kitchen, no intruder, no shadow. Just the empty cabin, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened at all. He didn't know how long he stood there, his mind reeling with questions he couldn't answer. Finally, he took a deep breath and turned away, convinced that it was just his imagination, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But even as he moved toward the stairs to go back to bed, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. This time, they weren't above him. They were coming from the hallway below. He froze in place, the blood draining from his face. There was no one there. He knew there couldn't be. The house was empty. But the sound of footsteps, clear, distinct, and growing louder with every passing second, was undeniable. Someone, or something, was in the house. His first instinct was to run, to grab his things and flee, but where could he go? The nearest town was miles away, and the woods outside seemed like an endless maze. No, the house was his only refuge. It had to be. But as the footsteps grew louder, closer, he realized that the house was no longer a refuge. It was a trap, and whatever was in it with him was closing in. In a panic, he grabbed the flashlight and bolted down the stairs. The house felt like it was closing in on him, the walls stretching, the shadows deepening. He reached the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest, and that's when he saw it. The figure. It was standing at the end of the hallway, its features still indistinct, its body just a blur of shadow. It didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at him. But then, with a sudden, jerking motion, it took a step forward. Marcus didn't think, didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, his breath coming in gasps, his legs pumping with desperation. But the figure wasn't far behind. He could feel it. He could hear it, the sound of its footsteps echoing behind him, steady, relentless. No matter how fast he ran, the figure kept up, never gaining on him, never losing ground. It was as if the house itself was chasing him, as if it was all part of a game he couldn't escape. He finally burst into the living room, his mind racing. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The house was too small, the walls too close. He was trapped. But then, as he turned, ready to face the figure head-on, it was gone. The house was silent once again, as if nothing had happened. Marcus stood there, panting, his body drenched in sweat. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, of fear, and of disbelief. What had just happened? Was it real? Or had he finally lost his grip on reality? One thing was certain, whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. The house wasn't done with him. And he had a sinking feeling that it never would be. The air in the old house was thick, like it had absorbed the weight of the years, the memories of everyone who had lived there before. Tessa stood at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the darkness that stretched ahead of her. It wasn't the first time she'd felt a coldness here, but tonight, something was different. The usual sense of discomfort had deepened into something more tangible, a heavy, almost suffocating presence that seemed to press in on her from all sides. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to make a move. The lights flickered above her, casting long, uneven shadows across the hallway. It was hard to tell if the flicker was the result of faulty wiring or something else, something older and much darker. She had tried to ignore the odd sensations in the house, the strange noises that came from the walls late at night, the feeling of being watched when she was alone. But tonight, the house seemed different. It felt more alive, more aware. She had moved in with her boyfriend, Nate, just a few months ago. The house, an old Victorian near the edge of town, had been abandoned for years before they found it. It was the kind of house that looked like it belonged in a ghost story, tall, looming, with a wraparound porch and windows that seemed to stare down at anyone who passed by. But it was perfect for them. The rent was cheap, the space was more than enough, and it had a certain charm to it, until now. Lately, the house had been feeling less like a place to call home and more like a space that was indifferent, or perhaps even hostile, to their presence. She couldn't explain it, but every time she turned a corner, every time she walked down the hallway, she felt as though there was something behind her, something just out of sight, something that didn't want her there. Nate didn't feel it, of course. He had dismissed her growing anxiety as nothing more than nerves. He had always been the practical one, the one who believed in logical explanations for everything. He hadn't seen the shadows flicker out of the corner of his eye. He hadn't felt the temperature drop suddenly in the dead of night, or heard the soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls. He hadn't experienced what she had, and he didn't understand why it was driving her crazy. She had tried to explain it to him, but his response was always the same. "It's just an old house, Tess. Old houses make noise. That's all." But tonight, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The house was different. The shadows in the hallway seemed to move on their own, slithering across the walls like dark, living things. She could hear them, just beyond her hearing, whispering things she couldn't quite make out. The whispers weren't like the wind or the rustling of the house settling. No, these whispers were deliberate, intentional. They spoke to her, urging her to listen, to come closer, to look deeper into the dark corners of the house where the light never reached. She took a step forward, her breath shallow, her heart racing. Her feet felt like lead, but she moved anyway, compelled by something she couldn't name. She had to see what was at the top of the stairs. She had to find out what was calling to her. The house groaned beneath her feet as she ascended, each step a reminder of how old the house was, how long it had stood here, waiting. She reached the landing and paused. There were 3 rooms on this floor, one of which they had turned into a small study, the other a guest room that they rarely used. The 3rd room, however, remained untouched, locked ever since they moved in. It was the room at the end of the hall, and no matter how many times she had asked Nate about it, he refused to open it. He said it was too cold up there, that the room had a strange draft that made it impossible to sleep in. But that wasn't all. There was something else about the room that neither of them had ever spoken about. Something unspoken between them, something that neither of them dared to acknowledge. And now, that room was calling to her. Tessa's fingers brushed the handle of the door, her breath coming in quick gasps. The cold metal felt like ice beneath her touch. She hesitated for a moment, her pulse hammering in her chest. Should she open it? Should she even be here? But the whispering was louder now, louder than ever before. It was almost as if the house itself were urging her to come inside, to look for the answers it had been hiding all this time. She turned the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness of the house. The room inside was dimly lit, its only light coming from the faint glow of the moon that seeped through the cracks in the curtains. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, and the furniture was old, covered in white sheets that had yellowed with age. The air in the room felt different, colder, thicker, as if something in this room had been waiting for her. Her eyes were drawn to the far corner, where an old wooden chest sat, its surface worn and scarred by years of neglect. The chest wasn't locked, but it was sealed tight, as if whatever was inside didn't want to be disturbed. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the chest held the key to everything, to the answers she had been searching for. Tessa took a hesitant step forward, her mind racing. What was in the chest? What had Nate been hiding from her? She didn't know what she expected to find, but she knew that she had to open it. She reached for the lid, her fingers trembling as she lifted it. Inside there were old, brittle papers, yellowed with age, and a few tattered books. But there was something else, something hidden beneath the papers. It was a small, black box, intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The box seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and as soon as she touched it, a chill ran through her body. The room grew colder, the whispers louder. Tessa's mind raced as she held the box in her hands. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that this box was important. It was connected to the house, to the feeling of being watched, to the coldness that had settled in her bones. She had to know what was inside. She had to open it. With shaking hands, she undid the clasp on the box and lifted the lid. Inside was a small, delicate pendant, shaped like an eye, its surface smooth and polished. The pendant was made of some dark metal, tarnished with age, and as she held it up to the light, the room seemed to darken even further. The whispers had stopped, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. But then, the silence was shattered by a loud bang. The door slammed shut behind her, and the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows twisting, shifting, as if the house itself were alive, aware of her every movement. Tessa turned, her heart in her throat, but the room was empty. Nothing had changed. The pendant in her hand felt heavy, almost like it was pulling her down, dragging her into the darkness that surrounded her. Her breath was shallow as she backed away from the chest, her eyes never leaving the pendant. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her gut, deep down, a primal fear that surged through her body. This wasn't just a trinket. This wasn't just an old piece of jewelry. This was a key to something darker, something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. She ran for the door, her feet slipping on the cold floor as she made her way back to the stairs. But as she reached the landing, she saw it, Nate. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said, his voice trembling. "You weren't supposed to know." Tessa froze, the pendant still clutched tightly in her hand. The whispers started again, louder now, echoing in her ears, filling the space around her. Nate's face was twisted in a strange expression, a mix of sorrow and something darker, something that made Tessa's blood run cold. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. But Nate didn't answer. Instead, he simply stepped back, his eyes never leaving her. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he began to back away into the darkness, vanishing from sight as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And Tessa realized, too late, that she had uncovered something far worse than she had ever imagined. The night was impossibly still. Not the kind of quiet that is peaceful, but the kind that weighs on you, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The cold had settled into the bones of the house, creeping in through the cracks in the walls, making the air feel heavy and damp. Jamie stood in the center of the living room, the room they had lived in for almost a year, and yet tonight it felt foreign to her, like a place she didn't recognize. The house, with its high ceilings, its grand but decaying furniture, and its dark, looming corners, had always been a little unsettling. But tonight it was something else. There was an oppressive presence in the air, a thickness that weighed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls, contorting into shapes that seemed far too unnatural. Jamie had always considered herself a skeptic, a logical person, someone who didn't believe in things like ghosts or spirits or anything that couldn't be explained. But as the days wore on, and the strange occurrences began to multiply, her skepticism was starting to erode. It began with the little things, the subtle noises that couldn't be explained away. The tapping from the walls, the creaks of the floorboards when no one was walking on them, the sensation of being watched when she was alone. At first, she had dismissed them as nothing more than the house settling, or perhaps a trick of the wind. But then things had started to escalate, and the logical explanations she clung to no longer seemed sufficient. The whispers had begun just a few days ago. Soft, distant sounds at first, as though someone was speaking just out of earshot, their voices muffled by the walls. But as the days passed, they grew louder, clearer. Sometimes they seemed to come from behind her, other times from the attic, or even from beneath the floorboards. Each time she turned around, expecting to find someone there, the room would be empty, the house eerily quiet, save for the ever-present hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of wood. At first, Jamie had tried to ignore the whispers, chalking them up to her overactive imagination. But the problem was that the whispers seemed to be directed at her, always following her, always coming closer. They would call her name in a voice that sounded almost familiar, and when she turned around, there would be no one. Just empty rooms and dark hallways, silent except for the sound of her own heartbeat. The unease she had once brushed off as nerves had slowly turned into a quiet, persistent dread that gnawed at her insides, that whispered in the back of her mind that something wasn't right, that something in the house was not only alive, but aware of her presence. Tonight, everything felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, as though something was about to happen. Something that had been building for days, or perhaps for years, and now it was reaching its breaking point. Jamie could feel it deep in her chest, a sense of foreboding that settled in her stomach like a stone. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching her, that the walls, the very structure around her, were aware of her every movement. Her heart began to race, and she moved towards the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. The faint whispers began again, low at first, like a distant murmur. But as she reached the stairs, they grew louder, clearer, until they were right behind her, just out of her reach. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. The whispers were real, and they were coming from somewhere inside the house, close, too close. The temperature dropped suddenly, the chill biting into her skin like a sharp, invisible hand. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the hallway was empty. Empty except for the darkness, stretching out in every direction. A shiver ran down her spine, but she forced herself to move forward, to keep going, even though every instinct screamed at her to turn and run. As she ascended the stairs, the whispers grew louder still, becoming almost frantic as though something, or someone, was trying to tell her something important. The words were garbled, unintelligible, but they were coming from the attic. The place where she had never dared to go. She had always known there was something up there, something hidden, something locked away. The door to the attic had been sealed shut when they first moved in, the latch rusted and covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Jamie had never questioned it, she had never felt the need to. But now, as she stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes drawn to the old, wooden door that led up to the attic, she couldn't ignore the pull. The pull to find out what was behind it, what was hidden away, locked in the darkness. The whispers were almost deafening now, rising in volume until they seemed to fill the entire house, overwhelming her senses. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to open the door. She had to see what was in there. Slowly, she approached the attic door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. The coldness was unbearable now, the chill wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She pulled the door open, the old wood creaking on its hinges, and as she stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. The air was thick, damp, heavy with dust and neglect. The smell of mildew and old wood filled her lungs as she took a step forward, her flashlight flickering in the gloom. She scanned the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The attic was filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and piles of junk that had been left behind for years. But it wasn't the junk that caught her attention. It was the presence in the corner of the room. The figure. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the old boxes. But when she stepped closer, she saw it. A figure, hunched over in the corner, its back to her, its shape indistinct, its features hidden in the darkness. Terror gripped her chest as she froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure didn't move, didn't react to her presence. It just sat there, unmoving, silent. The whispers had stopped. There was nothing but the heavy, suffocating silence now. She stood there, staring at the figure, her body shaking uncontrollably, her mind screaming at her to turn around and leave, to run as fast as she could. But she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the figure in the corner, her heart beating so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. Then, slowly, the figure turned its head. Slowly, deliberately, it turned to face her. And for a moment, Jamie couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The face, it was not a face she recognized, not a person she had ever seen. It was hollow, gaunt, with skin stretched too tightly over its skull, its eyes wide and unblinking, black pits that seemed to stare right through her very soul. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The thing in front of her was something else, something twisted, something ancient. Before she could react, the figure reached out toward her, its long, bony fingers stretched out in her direction. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as she spun around and bolted for the door. But the air was thick, the darkness pressing in around her, and every step felt like it took an eternity. She could hear the figure's footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The only thing she could do was run until her legs burned, until her chest ached with the effort. She reached the door, her hand slamming against the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. The thing behind her was getting closer, its presence almost suffocating. She yanked at the door, her heart racing, her panic threatening to consume her. And then, with one final, desperate push, the door opened, and she stumbled out into the hallway. But the whispers had returned. Louder, closer, more frantic. They were coming from all around her, the house alive with voices, and they were all calling her name. She ran, not knowing where she was going, just running, as if the house itself were chasing her. And as she ran, she realized that there was no escape. The house had claimed her. It always had. And now, it was never going to let her go. The wind howled through the broken windows, sending a cold draft sweeping through the empty rooms of the old mansion. It was the kind of wind that carried with it an unsettling sense of finality, as though it knew something was coming, something that couldn't be avoided. Lara stood in the middle of the darkened hallway, her pulse racing, the silence pressing down on her. Her breath came out in short, shallow gasps, her chest tightening with every passing second. She had been in the house for hours now, but it felt like days. The time stretched on endlessly, each moment a weight, each second heavier than the last. Her mind was swirling with fear and confusion, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold on. The house itself seemed to be alive in a way she couldn't quite explain. It was as if it had a presence, something that watched her every move, something that lingered just out of sight, waiting for her to make a mistake. The creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet, the whisper of the wind through the shattered panes of glass, the faintest echo of something moving in the distance, every sound seemed amplified in the suffocating silence, each one pulling her further into the nightmare she couldn't escape. She had come to this house on a whim, seeking answers, seeking a connection to the past. She had been drawn to it, compelled by something she couldn't explain. The mansion, abandoned for years, had a reputation, a dark, mysterious history that had fascinated her since she first heard the stories. They said it was haunted, cursed even, that the spirits of those who had died there still wandered the halls, trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering. At first, she had dismissed the rumors as superstition, nothing more than local folklore to scare off outsiders. But as she explored the house, she began to realize that the truth was far darker than she had imagined. The house had been abandoned for decades, left to rot in the desolate landscape. The walls were cracked, the floorboards warped, and the ceilings sagged with age. The furniture, once grand and elegant, was now covered in dust and cobwebs, forgotten by time. Yet there was something about it that drew her in, a pull she couldn't resist. It was as if the house was calling her, beckoning her deeper into its secrets, daring her to uncover what had been hidden for so long. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She wandered through the rooms, taking in the faded beauty of the mansion, the forgotten treasures that had once been the pride of its former occupants. But as she ventured further into the house, things began to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the silence more oppressive. It was as though the house itself had started to come alive, reacting to her presence, pushing her further into the darkness. The first sign that something was wrong came when she heard the footsteps. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, the creaks of the house settling under her weight. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic, as though someone, or something, was following her, moving just behind her, out of sight. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty, the rooms still and silent. Her heart had begun to race then, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She told herself it was just her nerves, that the house was old, and the sounds it made were nothing more than the natural wear and tear of time. But as the footsteps continued, growing closer, louder, more insistent, she could no longer deny that something was wrong. She tried to ignore it at first, to push the fear aside, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every room she entered, every corner she turned, there was the sensation that something was lurking just beyond her sight, waiting. Waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to uncover what had been buried for so long. And then there was the mirror. She had seen it in the corner of the hallway, tucked away beneath a heavy drape, its surface covered in dust. She hadn't meant to look into it. She hadn't meant to get any closer. But something had drawn her in, some unexplainable force that pulled her toward the mirror, made her stand in front of it, staring into the glass as though it held some secret she was meant to uncover. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the dim reflection of the hallway, the faint outline of her own face in the glass. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw it, just behind her, a shadow. It was fleeting at first, a small movement that could have been her imagination, but then it grew. The shadow was taller now, darker, more defined, and it was standing just behind her, in the reflection of the mirror. She spun around, her heart racing, but once again, the hallway was empty. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, standing just behind her, watching her with empty, hollow eyes. Its face was featureless, a blur of darkness, but it was unmistakably there. She could feel its gaze, could sense its presence in a way that made her skin crawl. Panic gripped her chest as she backed away from the mirror, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house before whatever that thing was reached out to her, before it pulled her into the darkness with it. But as she turned to flee, the house seemed to close in around her. The walls seemed to shrink, the air heavier, suffocating, and she realized with growing horror that she couldn't remember how to leave. The hallway stretched on forever, the rooms blurring together in a maze of shadows and whispers. She had been here before, she was sure of it, but nothing made sense anymore. The house was changing, warping around her, and she had no idea how to escape it. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. She couldn't understand the words, but they were clear, unmistakable. Someone was speaking to her, calling her name. She turned to face the sound, but there was no one there. The walls were silent, still. Yet, the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. They were all around her now, filling the space, pressing in on her from every side.